No missile left a silo. No soldier crossed a border. Yet one afternoon in 2012, an entire nation's banks went dark on the screens that move the world's money. The order was 3 lines long. It disconnected Iran from a Belgian cooperative most people have never heard of, and the effect was immediate. Oil kept flowing, but the payments for it could no longer find their way home. This is the shape of modern power. It doesn't announce itself with smoke. It announces itself with silence. A wire that never arrives, an account that won't open, a bank that stops returning calls.
We call this economic sanctions, and most of what the public believes about it is wrong. Most people picture a government banning trade with an enemy, the way you might refuse to shop at a store. That picture is a century out of date. The real machinery is quieter and far more effective. It runs not on armies, but on plumbing, the invisible pipes through which trillions of dollars move every day. Control the pipes, and you don't need to ban anything. You make it impossible for the money to travel. The country that built those pipes is the United States, not because Washington passed a clever law, but because the world chose the dollar. The dollar makes up close to 58% of the world's foreign exchange reserves, a share tracked by the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve. It sits on one side of nearly 90% of all currency trades, bought or sold in about 88% of them. When a Brazilian firm buys machinery from a Korean supplier, the deal is often priced and settled in dollars, currency neither country prints. That dependence is the foundation of the entire system. Here is the part that unsettles people once they see it. A dollar payment, wherever on earth it begins, almost always passes through the United States, physically through a computer in New York. And whatever passes through New York answers to American law. A transaction between a bank in Dubai and a bank in Shanghai in dollars touches US soil for a fraction of a second, long enough for Washington to see it and to stop it. That single fact is the engine of everything that follows. Sanctions aren't a wall around a country. They're a switch inside the global financial network, and the United States holds it. To understand how sanctions work, forget the embargo. Follow the dollar, where it goes, who touches it, and what happens the moment Washington decides it should stop. To weaponize a currency, you first need the world to depend on it. That dependence was built at a resort in New Hampshire in 1944, when delegates from 44 nations tied their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar to gold. The gold link died in 1971. The dollar link never did. By the time the world stopped trusting gold, it had learned to trust America's currency instead. And habits at that scale don't reverse. The dominance compounds because money, like language, is only useful when everyone else uses it too. A currency half the planet already accepts is safer to hold than one you'd have to convert twice. So central banks stockpile dollars, exporters price oil in dollars, traders quote wheat and copper in dollars. Each choice makes the next person's choice easier, and the network tightens around a single currency the way speech tightens around a single grammar. Consider what this means for a nation that isn't the United States. When Argentina buys natural gas, it frequently pays in dollars. When it sells soybeans, it's paid in dollars. Its debts are denominated in dollars. Its reserves stored in dollars. The price of nearly everything it imports set upstream in dollars. The country's economic life runs on a currency printed 2,000 miles away by a central bank it does not control and cannot vote for. Cross-border payments sharpen the picture. Of all international payments carried across the SWIFT messaging network, the dollar's share sits near 50% in recent years, according to the Federal Reserve's 2025 review of the dollar's international role, more than any other currency, and far above the US share of world trade. The dollar isn't just America's money. It's the world's accounting language, the unit in which strangers who share no border still agree to keep score. And an accounting language has a hidden property. Whoever writes the dictionary can rewrite who is allowed to speak. That power rests on a specific piece of architecture, a network of accounts banks hold inside one another, stretching back to New York. Once you see how that network is wired, the logic of sanctions clicks into place. Here is the fact that makes sanctions possible, and almost no one outside finance knows it. Your bank cannot send money abroad by itself. A bank in Nairobi has no vault in New York,
no direct line into the American payment system. To move a dollar, it must borrow someone else's access, an account it holds inside a larger bank that sits at the center. This is correspondent banking, the true skeleton of global finance.
Picture a chain of nested accounts. The small bank in Nairobi keeps an account at a mid-sized bank in London. That London bank keeps an account at a global bank in New York. When a dollar travels from Kenya to Korea, it doesn't fly across oceans. It hops down the chain. Nairobi's balance in London falls. London's balance in New York falls. New York credits the next link until the number lands where it's owed. The money never moves. Only the ledger entries do. Every one of those chains for a dollar payment runs through a bank under U.S. jurisdiction. There is no side door. A handful of major New York institutions form the choke point through which the world's dollars clear, and each lives or dies by its American banking license. That license carries a condition in plain regulatory language: obey U.S. sanctions law or lose your dollar access entirely. No bank on earth can afford that trade. This is why a sanction written in Washington reaches a warehouse in Shenzhen. The government doesn't police the warehouse. It tells the correspondent banks, this name is now forbidden. Route no dollars for it. Because every bank in the chain fears losing its own dollar access more than it values any single customer. The order travels down the chain on its own, enforced not by American agents, but by the self-interest of every bank in between. The system's genius is that it deputizes the world's banks to enforce American policy against their own clients. A compliance officer in Frankfurt, with no love for Washington, still blocks a payment rather than risk his bank's lifeline. The pipes police themselves. And the office that decides which names get poured into those pipes and which get shut out sits inside the U.S. Treasury, one most Americans have never heard of. Inside the Treasury Department sits the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. It is not large. It commands no troops. Its principal weapon is a document, a list of names it updates continuously, formerly the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, universally shortened to the SDN list. To appear on it is to be financially erased from the dollar world. Banks that clear dollars must screen every payment against it and freeze anything that matches. The list is not reserved for governments. It names individuals, companies, ships, aircraft, even specific crypto wallet addresses. A shipping magnate in one country, an oil trading firm in another, a vessel that changes its transponder to hide its cargo. Each can be added by name. Once designated, that entity is cut off not only from American banks, but from every bank in the world that wants to keep touching dollars, which is nearly all of them. The scale is easy to underestimate until you watch it move. On a single day in February 2024, marking 2 years since the invasion of Ukraine, OFAC designated close to 500 individuals and entities at once, according to a review of the year's actions by the law firm Miller & Chevalier. That was one announcement among many. The same review counted 8 separate rounds that year, each adding 100 names or more. The list grows in waves. What gives a name such force is the certainty of enforcement behind it. A designation is only a word on a page. Its power comes from every bank's knowledge that clearing a payment for that name, even by accident, even through 3 intermediaries, can cost the bank its own dollar access. Fear does the enforcing. OFAC writes the name, the global banking system carries out the sentence, quietly, at the speed of a database query. This is why the office punches so far above its size. It doesn't chase violators across borders, it changes one field in a file. And within hours, a person on the other side of the planet finds their wires bouncing, their accounts frozen, their suppliers unreachable. But a name on a list is only the beginning. The deeper machinery appears when a bank, somewhere, decides the list doesn't apply to it. For years, one of Europe's largest banks decided the American rules were negotiable. Between the early and mid-2000s, it moved billions of dollars through the US financial system for clients in sanctioned countries, stripping identifying details from the payment messages so the transactions sailed past the screening filters in New York. The money cleared, the names didn't show. For a while, it worked perfectly. The bank was BNP Paribas, And in 2014, the reckoning arrived. It pleaded guilty and agreed to pay $8.97 billion, the largest sanctions penalty in history to that point, confirms in the bank's own statement to shareholders. But the fine, enormous as it was, wasn't what made every other bank flinch. What mattered was a single added clause. For 1 year beginning in 2015, BNP Paribas was barred from clearing certain US dollar transactions directly. Read that clause again, because it holds the entire logic of the system. A fine is a cost. Losing the ability to clear dollars is an existential threat. For a global bank, dollar clearing is not a service it offers, it is the ground it stands on. Suspend it, even partially, even briefly, and clients flee, counterparties pull back, and the core business hollows out. The penalty wasn't the money, it was the glimpse of what happens when the switch is thrown. Every compliance department on Earth absorbed the lesson within days. The message was not, don't get caught. It was, no profit from a sanctioned client is worth risking your dollar access. Overnight, banks that had treated sanction screening as paperwork rebuilt it as a survival function, hiring thousands, buying software, overblocking rather than underblocking. The threat did more compliance work than any auditor ever could. That is the true nature of the weapon. It rarely needs to fire. The BNP Paribas case became the warning shot heard in every boardroom, and its echo is why a bank in a country that despises US foreign policy still freezes a payment Washington disapproves of. The deterrent runs on fear of the switch, and the switch has a second setting, one that reaches beyond America's own borders. Ordinary sanctions bind Americans. A US company can't trade with a blocked entity. A US bank can't clear its payments. But American law contains a more aggressive instrument, one that reaches people who are not American at all, doing business nowhere near the United States. These are secondary sanctions, and they turned a national policy into a global one. The mechanism is a threat aimed sideways. A secondary sanction tells a foreign bank, say one in India or Turkey with no US branches, that if it does business with a sanctioned party, it will itself be cut off from the American financial system. The foreign bank has broken no American law by trading with, for instance, an Iranian oil buyer. It doesn't matter. Washington isn't prosecuting a crime. It presents a choice. Keep that client or keep your dollar access. You cannot have both. Framed as a choice, it is really an ultimatum, and nearly every bank makes the same decision. On one side sits a single customer and its profit. On the other sits the entire dollar system. The ability to pay for imports, settle trades, hold reserves, and function as a modern bank at all. No rational institution chooses the customer. So the foreign bank drops the sanctioned client, not because its own government demanded it, but because the alternative is financial death. This is how US sanctions leap over borders American law cannot legally cross. Washington never orders the Turkish bank to comply. It has no authority to. It makes compliance the only survivable option and lets self-interest carry the policy the rest of the way. A rule that formally binds only Americans ends up governing banks in 100 countries, enforced by their own fear rather than by any treaty they signed. Other governments resent this deeply and say so. They call it the overreach of one nation's law onto everyone else's soil, and they are not wrong. Yet resentment changes little because the leverage is real, and the alternative is isolation from the world's dominant currency. The dollar's reach became America's reach, which raises the question every sanctioned government eventually asks. If the trap is built from the dollar, why not stop using it? Every country in the crosshairs arrives at the same idea. If the dollar is the leash, cut the leash. Trade in other currencies. Build payment systems Washington doesn't control. In principle, nothing stops two nations from settling in yuan, rubles, or gold. In practice, the attempt hits the same wall every time, and the wall isn't legal, it's gravitational. Russia offers the clearest laboratory. After 2014, and far more aggressively after 2022, Moscow set out to dollar-proof its economy, shifting reserves out of dollars, building its own financial messaging system to replace the one it feared losing, and pushing partners to settle in rubles and yuan. When selected Russian banks were removed from the SWIFT network in 2022, the Kremlin leaned harder on these homegrown alternatives. The effort was serious, well-funded, and backed by a large economy. It reduced the pain.
It did not escape the trap. A payment system is only as valuable as the number of people already on it, and every alternative to the dollar starts nearly empty. A Russian exporter can invoice in yuan, but then holds a pile of a currency with limited convertibility and capital controls attached, useful mainly for buying from China. The dollar's advantage was never a rule. It was the network, and you cannot legislate a network into existence overnight. Even workarounds that function carry a tax. Trade that detours around the dollar moves through smaller banks, longer chains, and less liquid currencies. And every extra link adds cost, delay, and risk. Sanctioned oil sells, but at a discount. Goods still arrive, but through intermediaries who charge for the danger. The sanctioned economy keeps breathing, yet pays a permanent premium for operating outside the main system, a friction that compounds year after year. This is the quiet reason de-dollarization moves so slowly, despite decades of predictions. Leaving the dollar isn't one decision. It's millions of decisions by banks, firms, and traders who each find it easier, cheaper, and safer to stay. The escape routes exist. They're narrow, expensive, and slow. Exactly what a well-built sanction is designed to ensure. And the tighter that friction squeezes, the more it invites the next move. Not escaping the system, but hiding inside it. When you can't leave the dollar system, the alternative is to disappear inside it. Sanctions evasion is rarely a dramatic act of defiance. It is a patient exercise in disguise, making a forbidden transaction look ordinary, so it slides through the same screening filters meant to catch it. The tools are mundane, which is exactly why they work. The most common trick is the front company. A sanctioned oil trader can't open an account under its own name, so it operates through a chain of freshly registered shell firms in permissive jurisdictions, each owned by another, the real controller, buried under layers of paperwork. To the correspondent bank screening the payment, it appears to come from an unremarkable trading company in a neutral country. The name on the SDN list never appears, because the name on the wire belongs to someone else. At sea, the disguise turns physical. Tankers carrying sanctioned oil switch off the transponders that broadcast their location, going dark for days across open water. They meet another vessel mid-ocean and pump the cargo across in a ship-to-ship transfer, so the oil that reaches port carries a different origin than the oil that left. Paperwork is forged, flags are swapped, and a barrel that began under sanction arrives looking clean. A shadow fleet of aging tankers exists to perform exactly this laundering of origin. The financial equivalent is the nested account, a sanctioned party quietly using a legitimate bank's correspondent relationship without that bank's knowledge. A small foreign bank with a New York correspondent lets a shadier institution route payments through it, and the sanction money travels inside a clean bank's pipes, hidden one layer up the chain. The correspondent in New York sees only its direct customer, not the passenger riding underneath. Detection means unmasking a client's client's client. None of this is cheap or safe. Every layer of disguise adds cost, and every participant demands a premium for the legal risk they carry. Evasion doesn't defeat sanctions so much as tax the sanctioned, forcing them to pay a surcharge on their own economy in exchange for staying alive. But the disguises keep evolving, and the people hunting them have evolved too, into something closer to financial detectives than diplomats. Catching evasion isn't done with spies in trench coats. It's done with data. The same payment records, shipping databases, satellite feeds, and corporate registries that make global trade legible also make it traceable. A small ecosystem of treasury analysts, private investigators, and specialized firms now spends its days reconstructing hidden ownership, following a shell company to its parent, a tanker to its true operator, a clean-looking wire back to a blocked name. The work resembles forensic accounting more than policing. When a vessel vanishes from tracking off a known loading port, then reappears days later riding lower in the water, that gap is evidence. When a brand new trading company in a permissive jurisdiction suddenly moves tens of millions in oil, that anomaly is a thread to pull. Investigators match transponder blackouts to satellite images, corporate filings to leaked registries, and payment patterns to known networks, assembling a case out of fragments no single record would reveal. That case turns suspicion into a designation. OFAC rarely acts on a hunch. It builds an evidentiary file, then adds the exposed shell company or vessel to the SDN list by name. The disguise that took months to construct is neutralized by a single database entry, and payments that flowed freely yesterday begin bouncing today. Every unmasking makes the next disguise more expensive because the evaders must burn the exposed structure and build a fresh one. The result is an endless contest with no final round. Investigators expose a network. The network dissolves and reforms under new names, new shells, new ships. Enforcers adapt their detection. Evaders adapt their disguise. Neither side wins permanently, and neither can quit. The sanctioned economy survives by constantly rebuilding its camouflage, while the enforcers survive by constantly tearing it down. A treadmill that consumes enormous effort on both sides. What keeps the enforcers ahead, when they stay ahead, is the same asymmetry that started this story. The evaders must hide inside a financial system whose central records the United States can see. Every disguise, however clever, eventually leaves a trace in a database that runs back to New York. That visibility is the enforcer's real edge, and it exists only because so much of the world's money still moves through American-controlled pipes. Which forces the harder question: how long does that visibility last? A weapon this effective invites its own overuse, and overuse carries a hidden cost. Each time the United States cuts a party out of the dollar system, it teaches that party, and everyone watching, a lesson. Dependence on the dollar is a vulnerability. The sanction works today by exploiting that dependence, but it also gives every target a permanent incentive to reduce it, so the same weapon works a little less well tomorrow. This is the paradox at the center of financial statecraft. The power comes entirely from the dollar's dominance, and dominance rests on trust. The world's belief that dollar access is reliable, neutral, and always available. Every high-profile cutoff chips at that belief. When banks and governments watch a country severed from the system, some conclude they could be next, and quietly begin building alternatives, holding other reserves, testing other rails. The weapon's use erodes the foundation it stands on. The effect is slow, which is what makes it dangerous to ignore. No single sanction triggers a flight from the dollar, but the cumulative signal that the currency can be turned into an instrument of pressure at Washington's discretion accumulates behind every reserve decision made by every central bank. The dollar's share of global reserves has drifted downward over 2 decades, from a peak near 72% in 2001 toward roughly 58% today, according to the Federal Reserve. A decline analysts attribute partly to deliberate diversification rather than market swings. None of the proposed replacements is ready to take the crown. The euro lacks a debt market deep enough to absorb the world's reserves. The yuan comes wrapped in capital controls that defeat the purpose of a reserve currency. Gold doesn't scale to the size of modern trade. The dollar's throne is safe not because it's loved, but because no rival is yet large, open, and trusted enough to replace it. The escape hatch stays narrow. Yet the direction of travel is what matters. A tool that works by being unavoidable grows weaker each time it reminds the world that avoiding it is worth the effort. The United States faces a genuine trade-off it cannot fully resolve. Use the weapon and win the immediate contest, or hold it back and preserve the dominance that makes the weapon possible. Every sanction is a withdrawal from a slowly depleting account, which raises the question of whether sanctions even achieve their goals. Here the story turns uncomfortable, because a weapon can be powerful and still fail at its stated purpose. Sanctions are extraordinarily good at one thing: severing a target from the dollar system. Whether that severing changes the target's behavior, ends a war, topples a regime, halts a weapons program, is a far messier question, and the historical record is mixed at best. The theory is that economic pain produces political change. Squeeze a country's finances hard enough, the logic goes, and its leadership reverses course to relieve the pressure. Sometimes this works, usually when the demand is narrow and the sanctions come paired with a clear path to relief. But often, the pain lands somewhere other than the decision-makers. The currency collapses, imported goods vanish, ordinary households absorb the shock, while the leadership, insulated and often enriched by the black markets sanctions create, feels comparatively little. Decades of sanctioned economies illustrate the pattern. Regimes under long-term comprehensive sanctions have frequently entrenched rather than collapsed.
adapting to scarcity, tightening internal control, and turning the siege into a story of foreign aggression that justifies their grip. The economy shrinks, the population suffers, and the political objective, the thing the sanctions were imposed to achieve, stays out of reach. Effectiveness and impact are not the same measurement. This gap between mechanism and outcome is the least understood part of the subject. The financial machinery is precise and nearly unstoppable at what it technically does. The political results are blunt, delayed, and unpredictable. A sanction can flawlessly cut a bank off from dollars, while completely failing to change the policy that prompted it. A perfect execution of the wrong lever, pulling on an economy in the hope that a government will feel it. That is the honest verdict scholars keep reaching. Sanctions are a reliable instrument of financial exclusion, and an unreliable instrument of political persuasion. They're used so heavily not because they consistently work, but because they occupy the empty space between a diplomatic complaint and a military strike. They are what a superpower reaches for when words feel too weak and war feels too costly, which is why their use keeps expanding, regardless of results. If the political results are so uncertain, why does every administration reach for sanctions more, not less? The answer has little to do with whether they work, and everything to do with what else is on the table. Between a strongly worded statement and sending troops lies a vast middle ground, and sanctions are almost the only tool that occupies it. They let a government act decisively without spilling blood or spending an army. The appeal is partly domestic. A sanction is visible, immediate, and satisfying. A leader announces it at a podium, names the villain, and appears to be doing something about a crisis on the other side of the world. It costs no soldiers, and on the surface, little money. Against the political price of war, or the impotence of inaction, a designation is cheap, fast, and clean. The incentives all point toward using it, and using it again. A ratchet effect is built into the tool. Sanctions are far easier to impose than to lift, because removing them looks like rewarding the target, and no politician wants to be the one who let a villain off the hook. So programs accumulate, layer upon layer, some outliving the crises that created them by decades. The list only grows. What was meant as a temporary measure hardens into a permanent feature of the relationship between two countries. Each new use widens the precedent. Once a financial tactic is deployed against one target, it becomes available against the next, and the definition of what warrants a sanction slowly expands, from war and terrorism outward to corruption, human rights abuses, cyber attacks, and drug trafficking. Infrastructure built for one purpose is repurposed for others, and the office that names names finds its list of nameable offenses growing longer every year. So the weapon spreads, not because it reliably achieves its goals, but because it fills a need no other tool can. It is the answer to a question every powerful state eventually faces. What do you do when a rival's behavior is intolerable, but war is unthinkable? For the United States, the answer has increasingly been the switch inside the financial network, which leaves the rest of the world with a decision of its own. The countries on the receiving end of American financial power have not stayed passive, and the response is reshaping the system from the edges inward. Nobody is abandoning the dollar in a dramatic break. Instead, a slow, deliberate drift is underway. A hedging of bets by governments that have watched what happens to those who end up on the wrong side of the switch, and decided to buy themselves insurance. The hedging takes quiet forms. Central banks trim the dollar share of their reserves and add gold and other currencies at the margins. Trading partners sign agreements to settle some bilateral trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar for specific flows. New payment messaging systems are built as backups, so a future cutoff from the Western network would sting less than it once did. None of these moves topples the dollar. Each loosens a single thread. The largest economies outside the American orbit have both the motive and the means to build alternatives. They have the trade volume to make settlement in their own currencies plausible, the technical capacity to construct parallel financial rails, and the strategic reason to want independence from a system another government controls. Their efforts are still small against the ocean of dollar transactions, but they are no longer experiments. They are policy, pursued patiently across years. What they are building is not a replacement for the dollar, but an escape hatch from it. Channels that would let critical trade continue, even if Western access were cut. That is a more modest goal than dethroning the dollar, and a more achievable one. A country doesn't need to end dollar dominance to blunt the sanction. It only needs enough of an alternative that being cut off is survivable rather than catastrophic. Survivability, not supremacy, is the real objective. The cumulative effect is a financial world slowly splitting into overlapping zones rather than a single unified system. It is not a sudden collapse of dollar power, but a gradual fraying, thread by thread, as more of the world builds the capacity to route around the center. Follow the money over a long enough horizon, and that is the story taking shape. Not a coup against the dollar, but a quiet, widespread effort to make its throne matter a little less. Step back from the mechanics and a larger truth comes into focus. The dollar is not merely a currency. It is infrastructure, a network as real and load-bearing as a power grid or a shipping lane. And like all infrastructure, whoever owns it holds a form of power that never appears on a map. The story of sanctions is really the story of what happens when one nation ends up owning the pipes through which everyone else's money must flow. This reframes the entire subject. We tend to think of national power in visible terms: armies, borders, resources, factories. But some of the most decisive power in the modern world is invisible, embedded in the boring systems that make daily life function. The payment networks, the messaging protocols, the correspondent accounts, the clearinghouses. Control the plumbing, and you control something deeper than any single transaction. You control the conditions under which everyone else is allowed to participate. The lesson generalizes far beyond finance. Whoever owns the essential network of payments, of data, of energy, of the cables and satellites that carry the world's information, inherits a quiet leverage over everyone who depends on it. Sanctions are simply the clearest, most developed example of a pattern spreading into every layer of connected modern life. The dollar showed what network ownership makes possible. Other networks are learning the same lesson. And every such network invites the same long-run response. The moment dependence becomes a vulnerability, the dependent begin, slowly, to build their way out. Not because escape is easy, but because the alternative is permanent exposure to someone else's switch. The dollar's dominance is durable precisely because it took generations and a world war to build and cannot be replicated quickly. But durable is not the same as eternal, and the drift away has begun. So the next time a sanction makes headlines, look past the country being named. The real story is the architecture underneath. The pipes, the ledgers, the choke points, and the single office that decides who may use them. That architecture is the closest thing the modern world has to a hidden lever of power. And understanding it is the difference between watching the news and understanding it. If this way of seeing the world is what you come here for, subscribe and stay. And tell me in the comments which hidden system you want mapped next. Return, finally, to that afternoon in 2012, when 3 lines of instruction disconnected a nation's banks from a Belgian cooperative, and the payments simply stopped. It looked like nothing. No explosion, no army, no border crossed. And yet it was one of the most powerful acts a state can perform in the modern age. The flip of a switch inside a network felt instantly on the other side of the planet. That is the truth this subject keeps circling back to. The most consequential power in the world today is not loud. It does not march. It sits inside systems most people never think about. The accounts banks hold in one another, the messages that move between them, the office in Washington that decides which names those systems will still carry. The power is real, precise, and almost entirely invisible to the public whose lives it quietly shapes. Everything traces to a single foundation. The world agreed to keep its money in one currency, controlled by one country, cleared through one set of pipes. That agreement delivered enormous convenience, and with the convenience came dependence, and inside the dependence sat a switch. For as long as the world keeps its money in the dollar, the hand on that switch belongs to the United States. And every sanctioned party, every hedging central bank, every quiet builder of alternatives is responding to that one fact. The system is not permanent. It was built, which means it can be unbuilt, slowly, by a world that has seen what the switch can do and decided to reduce its exposure one thread at a time. That unwinding will take decades, if it happens at all, and the dollar will likely hold its throne long after the predictions of its fall. But the drift is real,
And it was set in motion by the very power that sanctions so effectively display. For now, the machine runs as designed. A name is added to a list. A payment bounces in a city the person naming it will never visit. A bank on the far side of the world freezes an account rather than risk its own lifeline. No shot is fired, no order spoken aloud, and the world's most powerful weapon does its work in silence, through the pipes, along the ledgers, at the speed of a database query. That is how sanctions actually work.